The mop bucket wheels squeaked against the polished concrete floor of Naval Amphibious Base Coronado, their rhythm matching the methodical strokes of Lieutenant Commander Valentina Reaper Kozlova as she cleaned the SEAL Team 6 briefing room. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across tactical maps still pinned to the walls from the morning's operation planning. Empty coffee cups and protein bar wrappers littered the long conference table where America's most elite warriors had sat just hours before, discussing extraction protocols and rules of engagement for a mission that would never see her cockpit. The irony wasn't lost on her. 3 distinguished flying crosses, 2 Purple Hearts, and a Congressional Medal of Honor sat locked in a storage unit 30 miles away, while she pushed industrial cleaning supplies through hallways where men who'd never pulled a trigger in combat questioned her qualifications daily. The same hands that had guided a damaged A-10 Thunderbolt through Syrian airspace, while bleeding from shrapnel wounds, now gripped a mop handle, working 12-hour shifts to pay rent on a studio apartment that smelled like disinfectant and broken dreams. Nobody knew her call sign here. Reaper had died somewhere over the mountains of Afghanistan, along with her wingman, her confidence, and her belief that merit mattered more than politics. Now she was just Val the janitor, invisible in Navy-issued coveralls, cleaning up after warriors who whispered about the quota hire, who couldn't hack it when the pressure mounted. They didn't know about the 73 confirmed enemy aircraft destroyed, or the convoy of Marines she'd saved during the siege of Fallujah, or the classified mission that had earned her the nation's highest honor and a medical discharge she'd never requested. The radio on her belt crackled with routine base communications, but something in the background chatter made her pause. Intelligence intercepts were fragmentary, but the pattern was familiar: coordinated movement, electronic signatures, a buildup that felt like the prelude to something significant. Her trained ear caught tactical frequencies bleeding through commercial channels, amateur operators who didn't understand proper OPSEC discipline. The custodial staff heard everything and saw nothing, making them the perfect ghosts in America's most secure facilities. As she emptied another trash can filled with classified document shreds, Valentina wondered if anyone would notice if those intercepts suddenly stopped appearing in morning intelligence briefings. Probably not. After all, what would a janitor know about signal analysis or threat assessment? What could someone who mopped floors possibly understand about the delicate dance of modern warfare? The questions amused her as she wheeled her cart toward the next briefing room, where tomorrow's heroes would plan missions, while yesterday's forgotten guardians swept up their crumbs, listening to frequencies that carried whispers of approaching thunder. The base's evening routine continued around her, oblivious to the storm gathering on encrypted channels, guided by voices that sounded increasingly familiar with each passing hour. Valentina kept cleaning, kept listening, and kept remembering what it felt like when her call sign meant something more than fatting ink on forgotten commendations. 3 days later, the whispers on those amateur frequencies crystallized into something that made Valentina's blood run cold. She was restocking paper towels in the base communications center when the overnight radio operator stepped away for coffee, leaving his monitoring station unattended for the 30 seconds it took her to recognize the voice coordinating grid references in broken English. Dmitry "Hammer" Volkov, a Russian Spetsnaz operative she'd tangled with twice over Syrian airspace, both times walking away with bullet holes in her aircraft, and respect for an enemy who flew like a demon possessed. If Hammer was stateside, it meant the preliminary chatter she'd been tracking wasn't routine reconnaissance. The pattern she'd identified over the past week suddenly snapped into focus like a targeting system acquiring lock. Coordinated surveillance of naval installations, frequency mapping of emergency response protocols, timing analysis of shift changes and patrol rotations. Someone was preparing to hit a high-value target, and they'd been planning it while America's guardians focused on overseas threats, never imagining the enemy would come calling on home soil. The overnight operator returned, settling back into his chair without noticing that his frequency logs had been photographed by a smartphone with a cracked screen. Valentina continued her rounds, mind racing through tactical possibilities, while her hands performed the mindless routine of emptying wastebaskets and sanitizing surfaces. She'd tried going through official channels before, submitting intelligence reports through proper military bureaucracy, only to watch them disappear into administrative black holes while desk officers questioned her credentials and suggested she focus on her assigned duties. But this was different. This was Hammer, and if the Russians' presence meant what she suspected, official channels wouldn't move fast enough to prevent what was coming. The frequency patterns suggested a coordinated strike within 72 hours, timed to coincide with a major training exercise that would pull most of the base's rapid response assets away from critical infrastructure. Whoever was feeding intelligence to the Russians had access to operational schedules and classified movement orders. This was an inside job with outside muscle. Valentina finished her shift as the first gray light of dawn painted the Pacific horizon, her mind already formulating response scenarios, while her body went through the motions of clocking out and heading home. She had perhaps 60 hours to identify the threat vector, locate the enemy assets, and convince someone in authority that the janitor who emptied their trash cans might actually know what she was talking about. The storage unit containing her metals was only 30 miles away, but the distance between who she'd been and who she'd become felt like crossing an ocean of doubt and damaged pride. As she drove her battered Honda Civic through Coronado's empty streets, Valentina caught herself unconsciously checking her 6 o'clock in the rearview mirror, old habits asserting themselves as the warrior inside began to wake from her long administrative hibernation. By noon, the base's routine intelligence briefing would include 3 separate reports about unusual communication patterns detected by overnight monitoring stations, each one flagged for further analysis by different departments that rarely talked to each other. None of the reports would mention the janitor who'd first identified the pattern, or the fact that she'd already cross-referenced the signals with known enemy operators using methods that weren't taught in any military intelligence handbook. Valentina spent her morning off in a downtown San Diego internet cafe, using civilian networks to access databases that her custodial clearance level shouldn't have permitted her to reach. Old passwords from her flying days still worked, forgotten backdoors into systems that tracked her former colleagues and their current assignments. The picture that emerged made her stomach clench with familiar pre-combat tension. Hammer wasn't working alone, and the target wasn't some random installation. Naval Air Station North Island sat 3 miles away, home to carrier air wings and training squadrons whose aircraft regularly practiced over civilian airspace. If someone wanted to make a statement about American military vulnerability, a coordinated attack on aircraft launching from North Island would provide maximum psychological impact with minimal risk of international escalation. Shoot down a few training flights over populated areas, claim they were targeting legitimate military assets, and let the media coverage do the rest. The frequency analysis she'd compiled painted a timeline that converged on tomorrow's scheduled night training exercise, when a full squadron of FA-18 Super Hornets would be conducting low-level navigation training over Southern California. Perfect targets for shoulder-fired surface-to-air missiles, operated by teams that had been mapping flight patterns and identifying optimal firing positions for the past 2 weeks. Valentina ordered another coffee and continued typing, her fingers moving across the keyboard with muscle memory from countless intelligence briefings, where she'd been the one presenting threat assessments instead of discovering them in bathroom waste baskets. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling, the kind of operational intelligence that would normally trigger immediate security alerts and threat level escalations. But she wasn't Lieutenant Commander Kozlova anymore. She was just Val the janitor, and janitors didn't file intelligence reports about international terrorism. The solution, when it came to her, was both desperate and brilliant in its simplicity. If official channels wouldn't listen to a custodial worker, maybe they'd pay attention to someone who'd earned the right to be heard. Valentina closed her laptop and headed back to the storage unit, where her past waited in cardboard boxes labeled with dates that felt like ancient history. The Congressional Medal of Honor felt heavier than she remembered, its ribbon faded but still bearing the distinctive blue field dotted with white stars. Her flight suit hung in the back corner, name tape and squadron patches exactly where she'd left them 18 months ago, when the medical board had decided her combat injuries made her unsuitable for continued flight status. The Reaper patches, custom-made by her squadron mates after her 15th confirmed kill, still carried the scent of jet fuel and the memory of missions where every decision meant the difference between coming home or becoming a statistic. Valentina changed clothes in the storage unit's cramped space, transforming from invisible custodian back into the warrior she'd never stopped being. The uniform still fit, though the ribbons felt like borrowed valor from someone she used to know. Her reflection in the small mirror showed a woman who'd aged years in the span of months, but the eyes were still those of a pilot who'd never lost a wingman or left a mission incomplete. The drive back to Coronado took 20 minutes, but it felt like crossing decades of accumulated disappointment and bureaucratic dismissal. She parked in the visitor lot instead of the employee area, walking through the main gate with the bearing and confidence that had once made enemy pilots turn away from engagement rather than face the aircraft with Reaper painted on its nose cone. The duty officer at the front desk looked up from his paperwork with the expression of someone accustomed to routine interruptions, but his demeanor shifted when he noticed the decorations on her chest and the wings pinned above her left pocket. Combat veterans recognized each other across all service boundaries, and Lieutenant Commander Kozlova's record was written in ribbons that didn't require translation. "I need to speak with the base commanding officer immediately," she said, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had once directed airstrikes and coordinated battlefield rescues. "It's regarding an imminent threat to operational security." The duty officer was already reaching for his phone, recognizing that whatever had brought a Medal of Honor recipient through his door wasn't going to be handled with standard protocols and scheduled appointments. Within minutes, Valentina found herself in the same briefing room she'd been cleaning 3 days earlier, facing a conference table filled with officers whose expressions ranged from curiosity to skepticism. Commander Patricia Hayes, the base co, sat at the head of the table with the kind of professional composure that suggested she'd dealt with unusual situations before, but nothing quite like a decorated combat pilot emerging from custodial duty with intelligence reports about enemy infiltration. "Lieutenant Commander, your personnel file indicates you've been assigned to base maintenance for the past 18 months, Commander Hayes began, her tone carefully neutral. "Can you explain how you came to possess classified intelligence regarding potential threats to this installation?" Valentina placed her compiled frequency analysis and photographic evidence on the table, watching as the base intelligence officer's eyebrows rose with each page he reviewed. The data was thorough, professionally presented, and completely outside the scope of anything a maintenance worker should have been able to access or analyze. "Ma'am, custodial staff are essentially invisible in secure facilities," she replied. "We hear everything, see everything, and nobody expects us to understand what we're observing. I've been tracking unusual communication patterns for the past week, patterns that match operational signatures I encountered during combat deployments in Syria and Afghanistan." The intelligence officer looked up from his review, his expression shifting from skepticism to alarm. "These frequency analyses show coordination between multiple cell phone networks and amateur radio operators," he said. The timing correlates with tomorrow's training exercise, and the geographic distribution suggests surveillance of specific approach vectors to North Island. Commander Hayes leaned forward, studying Valentina with the intensity of someone reassessing everything she thought she knew about the situation. "Lieutenant Commander, why didn't you report this through normal channels?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a burning aircraft, carrying 18 months of accumulated frustration and dismissal. Valentina met the commander's gaze without flinching, drawing on reserves of dignity that had sustained her through medical boards and administrative reviews that questioned everything except her service record. "Because normal channels don't listen to janitors, ma'am," she replied quietly. "And by the time bureaucracy decided whether my intelligence was valid, American aircrew would be dying over San Diego County." The briefing room fell silent except for the hum of air conditioning and the distant sound of aircraft conducting routine training flights, oblivious to the threat that was counting down toward tomorrow's exercise. Commander Hayes studied the evidence spread across her conference table, recognizing that the woman sitting before her represented both a security failure and potentially its solution. Commander Hayes made the decision that would define the next 48 hours with a kind of instant tactical judgment that separated competent officers from exceptional ones. "All scheduled training flights are suspended pending security review," she announced, reaching for the red phone that connected directly to Pacific Fleet Command. "Lieutenant Commander Kozlova, I'm assigning you as special advisor to this operation. Your call sign and clearance are hereby reactivated." The words hit Valentina like a shock wave, 18 months of administrative exile evaporating in the space of a single sentence. Around the conference table, officers were already reaching for phones and opening laptops, the machinery of military response grinding into motion with efficiency that bordered on violence. Within an hour, the base had transformed from routine peacetime operations into a facility under heightened security alert. Perimeter patrols doubled. Electronic warfare specialists began jamming the frequencies Valentina had identified, and unmarked vehicles carrying federal agents began arriving through gates that normally processed only routine military traffic. But the enemy had been planning this operation for weeks, and they weren't going to abandon months of preparation simply because their communications were being disrupted. If anything, the increased security posture would accelerate their timeline, forcing them to strike before their window of opportunity closed completely. Valentina found herself back in the communications center, this time wearing lieutenant commander's insignia instead of coveralls, monitoring the same frequencies she'd been tracking while emptying waste baskets. The patterns were changing, adapting to the countermeasures with sophistication that confirmed her worst suspicions about the threat they were facing. "Hammer's too experienced to panic," she told the assembled tactical team. "He'll recognize that his communications are compromised and switch to backup protocols. We need to anticipate his next move instead of just reacting to intelligence he's probably already abandoned." The tactical display showed North Island's aircraft dispersal areas, highlighted with threat vectors that could accommodate shoulder-fired missiles positioned on civilian high-rise buildings or concealed in recreational vehicles parked along flight approach routes. Hammer would have studied American rules of engagement, knowing that U.S. forces couldn't simply shoot first without positive identification of hostile intent. As afternoon shifted toward evening, reconnaissance drones began detecting thermal signatures in positions that matched Valentina's tactical predictions. Multiple vehicles had arrived at elevated locations during the previous night's surveillance window, their occupants using civilian cover to establish fields of fire that would intersect with tomorrow's canceled training routes. "They don't know the exercise has been suspended," the intelligence officer realized. "They're still positioned for targets that won't be coming." Valentina studied the tactical display with the predatory focus that had earned her call sign, recognizing an opportunity that existed only because the enemy didn't realize their intelligence advantage had been compromised. "Then we give them what they're expecting," she said quietly, "but not what they're planning for." The plan that emerged over the next 6 hours was audacious in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. Instead of simply canceling the training exercise, they would conduct it exactly as scheduled, with one critical modification that would transform hunted into hunters and give America's enemies a lesson they wouldn't survive to share. Naval Air Station North Island's aircraft maintenance crews worked through the night, preparing modified training aircraft that carried more than just practice ordnance. The FA-18 Super Hornets that would launch at dawn bore no external markings to indicate they were anything other than routine training flights, but their internal systems had been upgraded with combat-grade targeting systems and live air-to-ground missiles. Valentina stood on the flight line as mechanics completed final inspections, breathing the familiar scent of jet fuel and hydraulic fluid that had defined the best years of her life. Commander Hayes approached from the operations building, carrying a flight helmet that bore a name tape reading Reaper in block letters that seemed to glow under the harsh ramp lighting. "Your medical clearance has been temporarily reinstated," the commander said, extending the helmet with a gesture that felt like passing a sacred trust between warriors. "Think you remember how to fly one of these?" Valentina accepted the helmet, feeling its familiar weight and the rough texture of the chin strap she'd adjusted thousands of times before missions that ranged from routine patrols to combat operations where every decision carried lethal consequences. "Like riding a bicycle, ma'am," she replied, though they both knew that fighter aircraft were considerably more complicated than childhood memories. The pre-flight briefing took place in the same room where she'd once cleaned coffee cups and emptied waste baskets, but now she sat at the head of the table wearing a flight suit that transformed her from invisible custodian into mission commander. The pilots under her command were younger than she remembered being, their faces carrying the confidence of peacetime warriors who trained extensively, but never faced an enemy who shot back with genuine intent to kill. "This is not a training exercise," she told them, her voice carrying the weight of 73 confirmed victories and missions where coming home alive required killing people who were trying to prevent exactly that outcome. "The targets we'll be engaging today have spent weeks planning to murder American aircrew over civilian-populated areas. They've chosen their ground, established their fields of fire, and they're counting on our adherence to peacetime rules of engagement to give them the advantage they need." The tactical briefing covered threat vectors, engagement protocols, and rules of engagement that had been modified to reflect the reality that enemy forces were already in position and preparing to fire on American aircraft. Unlike training exercises where mistakes resulted in failed scores and additional instruction, today's errors would be measured in body bags and burning wreckage scattered across San Diego's suburbs. As dawn approached, Valentina walked through her pre-flight inspection with muscle memory that had been forged in combat zones where mechanical failures meant more than emergency landings. Her FA-18 Super Hornet sat on the ramp like a predatory bird, its gray paint scheme designed to blend with cloudy skies, while sensors and weapon systems prepared to hunt targets that had no idea they were about to become prey instead of predators. The radio came alive with tower communications as engines began spooling up across the flight line, but Valentina's attention was focused on frequencies that civilian air traffic controllers would never monitor. Hammer's teams were conducting final communications checks, confirming fields of fire and target identification procedures that would begin in less than 30 minutes. "Reaper Flight, this is North Island Tower," the controller's voice crackled through her headset. "You are cleared for takeoff on runway 29 right. Contact departure control on 247.3. Valentina advanced her throttles and felt the familiar surge of power that transformed 30 tons of metal and electronics into something that could defy gravity with contemptuous ease. The runway rushed past her canopy, as acceleration pressed her back into the ejection seat. And then the ground fell away, as she climbed into morning skis that would soon become a battlefield where the margin between hunter and hunted would be measured in reaction time and superior firepower. "Reaper flight is airborne," she transmitted, her voice carrying across radio frequencies that enemy forces were monitoring, while they prepared to engage what they believed would be defenseless training aircraft flown by inexperienced pilots who'd never faced combat. The irony wasn't lost on her as she leveled off at 8,000 feet, leading a formation of aircraft toward targets that had spent weeks planning her destruction. Hammer was about to learn why her call sign had become synonymous with death for enemy pilots foolish enough to challenge her in aerial combat. But today, the lesson would be delivered from unexpected angles by weapons systems he couldn't see coming. Below, San Diego's morning traffic began moving through streets where surface-to-air missile teams waited in concealed positions, their weapons trained on approach vectors that would bring American aircraft into engagement range at precisely 800 hours. They'd studied the training schedule, analyzed flight patterns, and positioned themselves for maximum tactical advantage against targets they assumed would be flying predictable routes at predictable altitudes. What they hadn't planned for was facing Lieutenant Commander Valentina "Reaper" Kozlova, whose tactical modifications had transformed their carefully planned ambush into a coordinated counterattack that would eliminate the threat while gathering intelligence about the network that had brought enemy operatives onto American soil. The first missile launch came exactly when her tactical analysis had predicted, a heat signature rising from a downtown high-rise that had been under surveillance since the previous evening. Valentina rolled inverted and dove toward the launch point, her aircraft's targeting systems acquiring the building's roof, while her thumb moved toward the weapon release button with movements practiced in combat zones where hesitation meant death. "Reaper has eyes on launch platform," she transmitted, engaging with precision munitions. The AGM-114 Hellfire missile separated from her aircraft's wing pylon with surgical precision, its warhead designed to eliminate specific targets without causing collateral damage to surrounding structures. The explosion that followed silenced the surface-to-air missile battery while confirming Valentina's intelligence analysis about enemy positioning and capabilities. Across the tactical network, her wingmen were engaging similar targets with the kind of coordinated efficiency that separated professional warriors from amateur terrorists. Each missile launch was met with immediate retaliation, each enemy position eliminated before secondary shots could be fired at aircraft that had transformed from prey into predators with lethal swiftness. "All stations, this is Reaper," Valentina transmitted as the last enemy position went silent. "Threat neutralized. RTB for debrief." The flight back to North Island took 15 minutes, but it felt like crossing years of accumulated doubt and administrative dismissal. Below, federal agents were already moving through downtown buildings, where enemy operatives had discovered that attacking American military personnel on home soil carried consequences that extended far beyond their tactical planning. As Valentina's aircraft touched down on the same runway where she'd taken off 90 minutes earlier, she realized that her exile was finally over. The Congressional Medal of Honor in her storage unit would be returning to active display, but more importantly, the warrior who'd earned it was no longer hiding behind custodial coveralls and bureaucratic indifference. Commander Hayes was waiting on the flight line as Valentina shut down her engines, holding a folder that contained orders bearing today's date and official letterhead from Pacific Fleet Command. The paperwork inside would formalize what had already been decided during the morning's combat operations, but the real transformation had occurred when her call sign once again carried the weight of lethal authority over American airspace. "Welcome back to active duty, Lieutenant Commander," Hayes said, returning Valentina's salute with the respect due a warrior who'd proven herself in combat against enemies who'd underestimated both her capabilities and her resolve. The base's evening briefing would include detailed after-action reports about the successful neutralization of terrorist threats, but the most important intelligence gathered during the operation wouldn't appear in any official documents. Hammer's network had been compromised, their communication protocols captured, and their operational methods exposed through analysis that would prevent similar attacks across military installations nationwide. But for Valentina, the day's victory meant something more personal than tactical success or career rehabilitation. As she walked through the same buildings where she'd once pushed mop buckets while trained killers planned to murder American aircrew, she carried herself with the bearing of someone who'd remembered what it meant when enemies learned to fear her call sign. The storage unit containing her past would remain locked, but not because she was hiding from who she'd been. Lieutenant Commander, Reaper, Kozlova was back where she belonged, protecting American skis from threats that came in many forms but all shared the fatal mistake of believing that America's guardians could be caught off guard by enemies who'd forgotten that warriors sometimes wear custodial coveralls while they listen to frequencies that carry whispers of approaching thunder. In the months that followed, intelligence analysts would study the intercepted communications and captured equipment, building profiles of enemy networks that had been operating under American radar for years. But they would always wonder how a maintenance worker had managed to identify and track threats that had eluded official surveillance systems staffed by trained professionals, with access to the world's most sophisticated intelligence-gathering technology. The answer, they would discover, was both simpler and more profound than bureaucratic complexity could accommodate. Sometimes the most dangerous enemies are defeated by warriors who have learned that true vigilance requires watching from positions where nobody expects to find America's guardians, listening to frequencies that carry death while appearing to do nothing more threatening than emptying waste baskets and mopping floors that echo with the footsteps of heroes who never stopped fighting. Even when their uniforms changed and their call signs were forgotten by everyone, except the enemies who'd learned to fear them in skis far from home. Valentina's story would become legend among military personnel who understood that honor and duty weren't defined by rank structure or official recognition, but by the willingness to stand watch in whatever capacity service required, whether that meant flying combat missions over hostile territory or cleaning buildings, where tomorrow's heroes planned missions, while yesterday's forgotten guardian listened for whispers that threatened to become screams over American soil. The Congressional Medal of Honor returned to its place of honor, but the woman who'd earned it had discovered something more valuable than official recognition. She'd learned that warriors never truly retire. They simply find new battlefields where their experience and dedication can protect those who sleep safely, because others stand ready to do violence on their behalf. Whether that violence comes from 30,000 feet above enemy positions or from custodial closets where janitors with call signs listen to radios that carry the sound of approaching war.